When the German war machine tore into the heart of Russia, a desperate order was given. The factories must be saved. Entire industrial plants, the lifeblood of the Red Army, were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. This was an exodus of steel, a chaotic migration of unfathomable scale. With thousands of freight cars moving day and night, they were reassembled in the remote, forbidding safety of the Ural Mountains, a land of snow and iron. This was how Tankograd was born, a sprawling city of smokestacks and steel, appearing almost overnight in the wilderness. It was not a city of choice, but of grim necessity, built on and sheer willpower. With the men at the front, a new, untrained army of workers arrived with the machinery, women, teenagers, and the elderly. They were all evacuated from the burning West. They brought nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ghosts of their lost homes. Life in the new factory city was a brutal existence, a constant battle against the cold and the clock. The workers were housed in hastily constructed, uninsulated wooden barracks, often sleeping in crowded, tiered bunks with 3 or 4 to a single platform. The Siberian wind found every crack, leaving frost on the inside of the walls. Privacy was a forgotten luxury, and the proximity meant sickness spread like wildfire through the exhausted inhabitants. There was no life outside the factory's demands, no separation between work and survival. The factory whistle, not the sun, dictated the day, its shriek calling them to 12-hour shifts in the numbing cold. Food was scarce, rationed to the bare minimum of watery black bread and thin, cabbage water soup. They were not just workers, they were industrial soldiers, frozen and starving, holding a different, but equally vital, front line. The workforce was a reflection of the nation's desperation, a surreal collection of those left behind. The shop floor was run by Elena, a forewoman who had lost her husband in the first days of the invasion, and whose grief had hardened into cold, efficient rage. She oversaw a crew of women operating heavy cranes and lathes, machines they had never seen. Beside them worked boys, some as young as 14, their faces still soft with childhood. One of these boys was Mishka, a 16-year-old apprentice welder who had been studying for exams just months earlier. He had arrived alone, his father and older brother already at the front, their fates unknown to him at the time. These women and children were given an impossible, relentless task to build the T-30 for tank, the most vital weapon of the war. They were expected to do it faster than the enemy could destroy them, turning raw iron ore into a finished weapon in a matter of days. The T-34 was a brute, a war-winning combination of sloped armor, a powerful diesel engine, and a lethal 76mm cannon. The factory was a symphony of industrial hell, a place of deafening, non-stop noise, the shriek of metal on metal, and the blinding blue-white sparks of welding. Women strained to guide massive, multi-ton sheets of steel armor into place, their muscles aching with a fatigue that never subsided. The air was thick with ozone and the constant, acrid smell of hot metal and oil. Every rivet, every weld, every single gear was a matter of life and death for a 4-man crew they would never meet. A single mistake, a poorly welded seam, could mean a steel coffin for the crew at the first impact. The pressure from Moscow was relentless, the quotas ever increasing, posted on huge boards for all to see. More tanks, all for the front, all for victory, was the only message they ever received from the outside world. The only other news from the front came in small, dreaded, stay-tissued envelopes. The postman was the most feared man in the barracks, his rival causing a sick silence to fall over the workers. Each week, he brought letters from the front, their paper thin and worn, and with them, the official notices. They were impersonal forms, bordered in black, announcing those killed in action. One day, Elena watched as Mishka, his hands black with grease, opened his. He didn't cry or make a sound. He simply stood frozen for a full minute. He folded the paper that told him his brother, Sasha, was gone, killed near Vyazma, and went back to his welding station. The wall near the factory entrance became an unofficial shrine, a public ledger of their collective loss, covered in the names of the dead. The grief was a physical, crushing weight that threatened to halt production entirely. That night, Elena found Mishka in a dark, unheated corner of the barracks, his shoulders shaking in the silence. She sat with him, not as a forewoman, but as someone who understood. They were soon joined by Anna, a welder who had lost her husband at Stalingrad. Elena knew the shared, paralyzing grief could shatter their workforce, or it could be forged into a weapon. "The official letters are not enough," she said, her voice low and fierce. "We will not let them be forgotten," Elena declared, her words cutting through the cold. "They fight for us. We will build for them. We will send our dead back to the front." The pact was born in those shadows. For every man, brother, or son they lost, a tank would bear his name. It was an act of profound, personal defiance, a way to give their loss meaning. They would not just be building tanks, they would be arming their ghosts. The next day, Mishka's crew finished T-30 for number 188. It was a standard production model, smelling of fresh paint and diesel. As the inspectors went on their brief break for week tea, Elena stood watch, her eyes scanning the gantry. Mishka, his hand trembling, took a piece of chalk. He climbed into the driver's compartment, to the small, dark space where the driver would sit, a space that would soon see battle. On the inner bulkhead, where no inspector would ever look, but where the crew would live and fight. He wrote one word, Sasha. He touched the letters, a private funeral and a final, silent farewell to the brother he would never see again. He then took his welder and, in tiny, almost invisible beads, traced the name onto the steel, making it a permanent, hidden scar on the tank's heart. The secret was a spark that caught fire, a silent, shared understanding that needed no words. Anna, the welder, saw the new, cold resolve in Mishka's eyes and understood immediately. She approached Elena during the shift change, her eyes holding a silent question, and simply said the name of her husband, Ivan. Elena nodded. Anna's next weld, on an internal ammo rack, was her finest, a physical act of defiance and love. Soon, the pact was the factory's unspoken heart, a ritual that bound them more than any state propaganda. A mother of two dead sons used a metal punch to stamp their initials, DNP, onto a gearbox casing, a place only a mechanic would ever see. A young woman, whose fiancé was missing in action, would whisper his name, Victor, to each tank as she painted its serial number, a prayer sent with it. The secret was kept by all, a shared, sacred trust that would mean execution if discovered. But secrets were dangerous in a state built on surveillance. The factory was watched by Commissar Vlasov, a man from the political directorate, the NKVD. He was not a cruel man, but he was a rigid one, responsible for morale, production quotas, and hunting wreckers or saboteurs. He was trained to see subversion in everything that wasn't state-sanctioned. He began his watch, using informants, and his own sharp eyes to observe the shop floor. He noticed the change in the workers. They no longer looked defeated. They worked with a cold, silent, terrifying fury. He saw the small, hurried whispers between shifts, the shared glances that held to much meaning. He saw chalk marks near workstations, quickly erased before his patrols. He suspected a religious cult or a subversive ritual, something that could undermine the state's absolute authority. He began to watch Elena, the forewoman, in particular, sensing she was the center of it. The pact gave them a new, ferocious purpose, but the work still demanded its price. They were working with scavenged steel and worn-out tools, pushing the machinery past its breaking point. The 12-hour shifts became 14, then 16 hours, as the front line demanded more. They slept by their machines, covered in rags. The cold in the factory hall was so bitter that the grease on the tank treads would freeze solid, and men's hands would stick to the bare metal. They were soldiers on the labor front, and there were casualties here, too. Malnutrition led to scurvy and night blindness. Exhaustion led to fatal accidents. Mishka, exhausted and dizzy, badly burned his arm on a white-hot steel plate, but refused to go to the infirmary. "Sasha's tank needs its gun," he said through gritted teeth, his face pale with pain. They were fueled by grief and rage, burning themselves out to arm their dead, and the human cost was staggering. Commissar Vlasov finally confronted Elena. He had found a small, etched Mikhail on a rejected piece of armor plate, tossed in the scrap heap. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous, holding the piece of metal up. "What is this, Mikhail? Are you marking state property? This is sabotage. Or worse, it is a prayer, which is counter-revolutionary. Elena, her heart pounding against her ribs, looked him in the eye, her own gaze just as hard. Mikhail was my husband, Comrade Commissar. He was killed at Smolensk. Anna's Ivan is on that tank. Mishka's Sasha is on that one. She pointed, refusing to back down. We are not saboteurs. We are giving the tanks a soul that hates the fascists as much as we do. Is that against the state? Vlasov was a man of rules and ideology, but he was not a fool. He saw the raw, burning hatred in her eyes, and he understood the terrifying production numbers. The factory was exceeding its impossible quota by 50%. This ritual was turning grief into a high-speed assembly line. He was a pragmatist beneath the uniform, and he knew a weapon when he saw one. He looked at the etching, then at Elena, and then at the long line of tanks waiting to be shipped. He brushed the snow from his shoulder, a slow, deliberate gesture. The state has no time for souls, Tovarish, only for tanks. He paused. See that your workers' enthusiasm does not slow the line. He turned and walked away. The pact was no longer a secret. It was an officially ignored, and therefore sanctioned, weapon of war. The work became a ritual of vengeance, a sacred duty. The women and teenagers no longer just built tanks, they forged individual, rolling monuments. A woman would mutter as she tightened a bolt, killed at Sevastopol. She would put all her strength into it, as if striking the enemy herself. This one is for Alyosha, Mishka would whisper, his weld sealing a hull, who never saw his son. The factory became a harvest of steel, each T-30 for a seed of retribution, a vessel for a fallen soldier. They were no longer building machines. They were arming their dead, giving them one last fight. They poured their loss, their love, and their bottomless, freezing rage into every piece of steel. They were creating an army of ghosts, and that army was growing by the hour. A message arrived from Stavka, the high command. A massive German offensive was expected near a small railway city called Kursk. The quota was doubled again, effective immediately. For a week, no one slept more than an hour at a time. The factory yard, once empty, filled with new green tanks, hundreds of them, each bearing a hidden name, each a promise of payback. The workers, swaying on their feet, collapsed at their stations, only to be shaken awake. When the long train of flatbed cars arrived, the entire factory came out to watch them go, even those who were sick. The workers stood in the freezing wind, their faces pale, hollow-eyed, and exhausted. As the train groaned and began to pull away, they did not cheer. They raised their hands, some gloved, some bare in a silent, collective farewell. They were watching their steel heroes, their husbands, and their sons go to war one last time. Months later, in the dust and fire of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, a T-30 for commander was forced to bail out. His tank was crippled. His driver, a new boy, was dead. As they pulled the young man's body from the driver's hatch, the commander noticed something on the bulkhead, revealed by the fire that had scorched the paint. Etched into the steel were the letters Sasha. He never knew who Sasha was, or the boy in the Urals who had inscribed his name. But he knew that tank had fought with a spirit he couldn't explain, absorbing 3 direct hits that should have destroyed it. Back in Tankograd, Elena, Mishka, and the others received a new quota and a new list of names. The work continued. The names were never spoken, but the factory of heroes had sent its ghosts to war, and they were finally winning.